1. The inspiration from Aristotelian metaphysics. This part demonstrates Bergson's retrieval of several terms and distinctions developed by Aristotle, most notably in relation to intuition, concreteness, continuity, and intensity. It also examines closely related discussions concerning number, infinity, and indivisibility. These Aristotelian themes were central to the language and distinction used in expressing concrete duration and intuition in Bergson's first major work, Time and Free Will. This analysis will help shed light on the complicated role that Aristotle played in Bergson's philosophical development. I argue that Aristotle approached the problems of physics and metaphysics on the basis of continuity as an internal dynamism that is irreducible to presence to consciousness. Rameau and Eugenius, said that wrong, in 1991 article L'inspiration aristotelienne de la métaphysique de Bergson demonstrates the link between Aristotelian metaphysics and Bergsonism. They emphasize the role of internal nature or interior dynamism, which is found in Bergson's doctoral thesis, Quid Aristoteles de loco sensere. The account Bergson gave of continuity in his thesis makes no reference to its importance on the developments that he worked on contemporaneously with Time and Free Will, which dealt with psychological problems related to time, quantity, intensity, and freedom. Heidegger was perhaps the first to suggest that the two works had a common inspiration, though Rameau and Eugenius agree that there is an important connection. They went against Heidegger's interpretation of the role that Aristotle played, saying that it would certainly be difficult to agree with the observation of Heidegger according to which Bergson would have arrived at the thesis Time is Space, based on the expeditious interpretation of the Aristotelian definition of time, like arithmos kinesis. Our analyses clearly suggest that Bergson never linked the Aristotelian definition of time to space. Rather than seeing Aristotle as merely an example of spatializing time or substituting space for time, Bergson claimed that Aristotle had substituted the problem of space with that of place, topon. This will be addressed later. However, briefly, place, unlike space, is linked directly to the qualities, forces, and interior dynamism of natural bodies. It is the relation, in this sense, of interiority that Rameau and Eugenius were able to demonstrate Bergson's Aristotelian inspiration. This analysis illustrates what we know to be their points of agreement, which is, above all, a conception of metaphysics that does not remain content with abstract generality, but instead relies on experience by concentrating attention on concrete individuals. Part 1, Section 1, A Metaphysics of Concrete Individuals. Subsection 1, The Primacy of Intuition. Felix Ravissant had an undeniable influence on Bergson's approach to philosophy. Bergson's investment in certain Ravissonian themes appears most obvious in their shared emphasis on intuition. What may even be called a primacy of intuition is evident in each of their philosophies. By primacy, I mean treating intuition as the factor on which the progress in philosophy depends. Intuition, for both, involved a concentration of thought on a concrete individual, which is opposed to a mode of thought that merely generalizes and abstracts. This is the conception of metaphysics that Ravissant had developed in his interpretation of Aristotle. I follow this interpretation and show how Ravissant prepared the path for Bergson's retrieval of Aristotelian approach to metaphysics, which involves, first, the primacy of intuition, second, an interiority of motion, and third, concentration of thought on concrete motion as the ultimate goal. In his essay, written as a eulogy to the work of Ravissant, Bergson called attention to his approach to metaphysics, characterizing it as two ways of relating or contrasting differences between colors. We may suppose that these two ways were meant to show, to a careful reader, his own indebtedness to Ravissant's vision of metaphysics, Interpreting this as a nod indicating Bergson's partial alliance to the Ravisonian vision of metaphysics helps explain why he qualified this claim, saying, "I do not feel I am betraying the governing idea of Ravison by saying that there are two ways." End quote. The betrayal would presumably be the imposition of Bergsonian terminology on Ravison. The two ways, as we will see, are essentially the same as the perennial division in Bergsonism of two tendencies, the ways of intellect and intuition. The first way is cinematographical relative knowledge, which advances by approximation. The second places us directly in concrete reality. This indication already casts considerable doubt on the critique of Aristotle in creative evolution, as Ravison seems to have inspired the two ways or two tendencies from his long engagement with Aristotelian metaphysics. Worms 2005 pointed out that Bergson intended creative mind to be a collection of texts that concerned his method of thought, that is, of thinking sub specia de rationes, in Bergson's words. Thus, we may see the inclusion of Ravison in this work as a clear indication of the role that the latter played in the development of Bergsonism. Intuition and light. Bergson's debt to Ravison, tying his thought to that of Aristotle, has been expressed by the image of relating pure light to an infinity of nuances of colors. Bergson underlined this Aristotelian inspiration for Ravisonian metaphysics. Quote, "The idea he puts at the bottom of Aristotelianism is the very one which inspired most of his meditations. Throughout his whole work rings the affirmation that instead of dilating his thought in the general, the philosopher should concentrate it on the individual." End quote. These are the two ways. One is natural to human life and coexistent with habit and intellect, but will lead to insolvable metaphysical problems. The other is the only way for philosophy to make progress. Let us recount the relevant aspects of Bergson's text on Ravison here to show how this reading of Aristotle makes intuition the goal of metaphysics. Quote, "There are two ways of determining what colors have in common, and consequently of philosophizing on them. The first consists simply in saying that they are colors. The abstract and general idea of color thus becomes the unity to which the variety of shades is reduced. But we obtain this general idea of color only by removing from the red that which makes it red, from the blue that which makes it blue, from the green what makes it green. We can define it only by saying that it does not represent either red, blue, or green. It is an affirmation made up of negations, a form circumscribed in vacuum. The philosopher who remains in the abstract stops at that. He thinks he can proceed to the unification of things by way of increasing generalization. He really proceeds by gradual extinction of the light which brought out the differences between the colors. The ends by blending them together into a common obscurity. Quite different is the method of true unification. In this case, it consists in taking the 1,001 different shades of blue, violet, green, yellow, red, and by having them pass through a convergent lens, bringing them to a single point. Then appears in all its radiance the pure white light which, perceived here below in the shades which disperse it, enclosed above in the undivided unity, the indefinite variety of multi-colored rays. Then would also be revealed, even to each shade taken individually, what the eye did not notice at first, the white light in which it participates, the common illumination from which it draws its own coloring. Such is no doubt the kind of vision that, according to Ravison, we must ask of metaphysics. The object of metaphysics is to recapture in individual existences and to follow even to the source from which it emanates the particular ray which, while it confers on each one its own particular shade, attaches it by that means to the universal light. End quote. There are many things to address here. First, let's try to make sense of this description given here of these two ways of treating light, and then compare it with Aristotle's thought before going on to examine how Ravison had utilized this image. The first mode of thinking of the differences between colors is to reduce the shades to white light by desaturating all the colors until they no longer have any difference, looking like a homogeneous empty light. Light in this sense is an affirmation made up of negations, a form circumscribing a vacuum. It would be devoid of the differences among colors in the way that white paint is devoid of pigments. The light is reduced to a general idea, a logical generality substituting the many differences with one which expresses nothing of the differences it subsumes, as it was reached by subtraction. This is meant to characterize a faulty mode of conducting philosophy, as an overly simple characterization of Platonic forms as abstract generalities. This false approach to philosophy, quote, proceeds by gradual extinction of the light which brought out the differences between the colors, and ends by blending them together into a common obscurity. End quote. In order to do metaphysics, we must surpass this false approach. We must instead approach the unity of light as a concrete universal, as according to Deleuze. In the second sense, we will not empty the light of its differences. Rather, we will, quote, take the 1,001 different shades of blue, violet, green, yellow, and red, and by having them pass through a convergent lens, bringing them to a single point. Pure light is then the unity of an infinity of nuances, of shades, or of gradations and differences. Intuition is the convergence of the multiplicity of qualitative differences into a unity that is not abstract or general, but that is intimately related to the differences it unites. It is not external to the colors it illuminates. It is not a foreign power that assimilates differences into a common obscurity. When we send pure light through a prism, it produces the spectrum of 1,000 shades. The relation between unity and multiplicity, then, is concrete rather than abstract, and their convergences are generative rather than subtractive. The infinity of differences are not at all like an infinity of divisions in the interval of space, homogeneous and externally coordinated. We fabricate these generalized homogeneous differences by intellectual abstraction. Logic and mathematics deal with this sort of abstract symbols that replaces concrete differences. Metaphysics, then, consists in the second approach. The object of metaphysics is to recapture in individual existences and to follow even to the source from which it emanates the particular ray which, while it confers on each one its own particular shade, attaches it by that means to the universal light. This universal light will be like the unity of intuition, which is the generative idea producing all the particulars. The analogy between intuition and light is already seen in Aristotle's De Anima. In Bergson's interpretation of Ravison, we find that the analogical sense of light as intuition is made to overlap with Aristotle's notion of focal meaning, pros hen, as Owens had famously named it. In the image given by Bergson, the convergence of light is analogous to a focalization. As the diversity of colors converge in pure light, so too the diversity of ways of being are made to converge in the intuition of the unity of being and individual substance, as in metaphysics. This convergence is not a subtraction of the particular of each shade, but rather an addition by which all parts join together as contributing positively to pure light. Pure light includes the infinity of shades, whereby each is a positive ingredient in the generative idea of their common illumination. Aristotle did not use this exact optical imagery of a convergent lens. He did, however, make comparisons of universality and particularity with reference to light and color. He dismissed a universal color that was like a common obscurity of a general essence in metaphysics. To be color is equally true of blue and yellow, but has no particular value for either. And if knowledge were merely of this generality, it would lack all individuality and substance. Knowledge is said to be universal both truly and not truly, because it is universal only in terms of potency, but when actualized, it will always involve particulars. We will explain this in more detail below, but the basic gist of the argument says that knowledge is universal as potency in the sense of an acquired generalization. However, this generalization is not knowledge properly speaking. It is only the material ingredient in the construction of thought that requires the intuition of individuals in which the generality is divided and actualized. We cannot enter into the subtleties of Aristotle's theory of light and color here. See Sarabji, 1972. We must touch merely upon a few things to show that the connection among light, intuition, and focalization has textual support. Explaining light in De Anima, he said that the being of color is to be capable of causing movement in what is transparent, and the actualization of the transparent is light. The perception of colors involves the incorporation of light, a medium, air or water, and a sense organ. Light is an activity that acts on the medium. When the medium is activated as light, it is moved by the color on the surface of the bodies, and the movements are propagated in the eye jelly. Light is thus immaterial and unaffected by the illumination it creates. It is for this very reason that it is analogous to intuition. It is an agent that always acts in the same way, but that meets up with each particular nuance by activating its particularity. Light makes potential colors into active colors. The active colors are nuances made visible by light. Potential colors are not seen. They are what can be seen when light acts. Similarly, the potential thought, universals, acquired in experience and held in memory, are enacted by thinking. The intellect always acts in the same way, so the soul is the same as to be the essence of soul. Whereas for human and color, to be human is different from a human, as it is indifferently true of every human as to be color is of every color. Thus, light and soul are different from human and color in their essence, is also their individuality. Aristotle wrote that both the body and the soul are called animal, but by one definition, not by one definition, but with reference to one thing, pros hen. To understand this, we must turn to analogy and focal meaning, and later to activity, all of which involve unity in a concrete act. Activation is the primary sense of individuality. Rather than say that someone is human, it is truer to say that they are psyche, as this is the essence and substance in the sense of a generative and activating ingredient of the compound. Thus, quote, the proximate matter and the concrete shape, morphe, are the same and one potentially and the other actively. Both light and soul are a unifying ingredient that makes the composite a unity by its very way of existing at all, as an act of unification. We do not abstractly join this matter to this form as if they existed in separation beforehand, but rather find them concretely unified in experience as actually enduring unity. In this sense, intuition is both the convergence of details and the act by which the soul is aware of this multiplicity in an individual apprehension. Focalization and analogy. In metaphysics and the topics, health is explained as having a focal sense that is expressed by the convergence of irreducible and different ways of being. We say things are healthy in relation to several ways of being involved. This healthy food, this healthy animal, this action that is healthy for the animal, or even that one walks after dinner in order to maintain their health. Here, all the different perspectives involve the ways in which health relates to the actual processes involved in a living being. These examples reveal the diverse ways of saying cause, as the focal meaning of health involves the four causes of health. The sense of health must incorporate a sense of each cause, and this will make its individuality and substance evident. We have a sense of health through each of these perspectives on the whole, but none of them alone exhaust the sense of health. It is crucial to note that one does not grasp the idea or representation of health in a single instance, or from a single aspect, but rather by a multiplicity of perspectives that are irreducible to each other and that converge together. We do not find an explicit joining of light with focalizing or analogy, or a physical convergence of light in any of Aristotle's existing works. Nevertheless, they have a connection, as each is intended to express aspects of an ultimate intellectual activity that is required in philosophy, as well as a real, or we may say ontological form of unity, substance as a simple unity of multiplicity, complexity, and detail. Thus, focal meaning provides a means of unifying multiplicity without collapsing or eliminating diversity. This entire discussion brings Aristotle's complex and enigmatic use of analogy into play. Analogy means several things. It means arithmetic proportionality. More generally, it is a comparison of two similar relations. It is a relation of relations. It can also function as a poetic technique that evokes a sense of inner life by appealing to a listener's sensibility. It is a term with latitude, and there are, without a doubt, both concrete and abstract senses. The history and evolution of the question of focalization and analogy has been explored with great clarity by Erich Schumacher in Aristotle on the Nature of Analogy. Schumacher argued against Owens, along with Eubank, that focal meaning is coextensive with analogy, and does so based on an extension of the significance of analogy beyond its mathematical formulation as a relation of proportionality. By connecting the two key passages, Metaphysics 4 and 12, that Owen used to differentiate analogy and focal meaning, Schumacher showed how Aristotle's conception of focal meaning and analogy are not identical, but are inverse perspectives on the same double movement, and that each is implied by the other. Analogy emerges in the course of Schumacher's work as a general ability of the soul to gather memories, images, perceptions, and thoughts together into a simple whole, or unity, which both relates and differentiates what has been gathered together. Analogy is an ability to make the past relevant by gathering again, that is, to think of something based on the basis of something else, or to perceive this based on those memories. We can approach this double movement of gathering and differentiating in a way that emphasizes one or the other of the aspects, that is, focalization and analogy. Owens' 1989 used these two aspects to try to prove the difference between analogy and focal meaning, referring to the former as the outward comparison and the latter as the inward one. Thus, analogy is said to take a certain relationship, matter, form, privation. It goes out to new things and applies it to them. Focal meaning, on the other hand, will draw in many irreducible different things into a concentrated meaning. We have seen the way in which causes are focalized in the compound substance in the example of health. Aristotle said that analogy is responsible for how we think of the causes of diversity among natural individuals. We think of two different animals with unique features or behaviors, but with a similarity in the convergence of causal ingredients. Based on this analogy, we can say healthy horse, healthy human. We do not mean exactly the same thing in each case, as human health does not involve the same things as horse health. They have different causes and are diagnosed through different signs. Nevertheless, they are understood through a convergence of causes that have an analogous relationship. Thus, the outward movement of analogy is already implied by the convergence of focal meaning, as it is by being focalized that there are any analogy, and even focalization is potentially an analogical mode of relating causal ingredients. To think of health as focalized in one thing is already to think analogically of causes. Schumacher thus provided an admirable alternative formulation of the problem by showing that analogy, taken as a mere structure of proportion, is secondary derivative and insufficient to, quote, capture the primary dynamism of the term. He went further and showed that Owen's interpretation of focal meaning was also overly reductive and eliminated the hidden dynamism. The approach of Owen's interpretation was to understand a focalization of the definition, so health is a central term used in defining healthy food, for example. We can call this the static or logical interpretation. However, Schumacher shifted the meaning of focalization away from the concepts and definitions to a more intuitive and concrete sense. It is not about the semantic meaning of a definition being distributed to other concepts. It is not like a tree-style genealogy either. Rather, it is a means of thinking of the central relevance of a diverse set of interrelated but differently significant ingredients that are involved in a unified reality, individuation. At the heart of this interpretation lies the relationship between unity and diversity, rather than the abstract relationship that subsumes a particular unity under a metaphysical multiplicity, a universal multiplicity. The unity of focalization is instead a unity of generation wherein multiplicity is subsumed by unity. It is the unity of physis as a principle, which contains a variety of expressions, and it is this inner nature that expresses itself in many ways without diluting itself in the process. The presence of healthy food is enough for the entire reality of health to show itself, but not by merely linking it back to a concept. It is not merely an association based on our hunger, as the idea of health is what would make such an association relevant in the first place. The association cannot be the cause of the idea. It is rather a relevant association to make only because of the general relevance that anything whatsoever has an experience, thought, or imagination can have with respect to the active condition of life that we call being healthy or sick. This is exactly how Aristotle thought of the activity of health, and is why he used this example for focalization. Health is a sort of vital principle or directing idea that is focused as a tendency by which we spontaneously strive for it. The most fundamental senses of both health and proshen are teleological. We think of health as a good. Health shows up in our awareness on the basis of its preferability. Things are relevant in relation to it, and it is the central relevance by which we perceive things as painful or pleasurable. The entire sense of life that includes striving of different sorts, philosophical life that strives for the uncovering of being and stretches out towards truth, is a striving animated by the central focalizing tendency of life and nature. Far from being logical relations of concepts, focalization and analogy are feelings or intuitions of relevance that give a common directionality of multiplicity. Ultimately, focalizations always lead to the primary mode of being of Aristotle's metaphysics, individuality. It is such an important and subtle mode of existence that it required him to point to it using two new names, energeia and entelecheia. As we will see below, the meaning of energeia arises from induction. That is, a review of many individuals in which we discover irreducibly different relations obtained in each case. This means that we say something is actual in many ways. In each case, there is an analogous relation that is directing or unifying multiplicity. Schumacher clarified how intuition, nous, by relating to principles, arche, involves both analogy and focalization. As Aristotle outlined, this very reliance on principles in our knowledge of nature and the soul is itself analogical. Schumacher's identification of the faculty of intuition with analogy is well founded in the text, and this helps understand how intuition factors into human thought. It is not merely a theological hypothesis or postulate, but an indispensable ingredient in concrete human thought. The unity of the material principles of thought and the universals that the soul grasps by intuition are focalized unities. The intuition of principles was described by Aristotle as indivisible and is said to take place in an indivisible now, but it is also at the same time an act of distinguishing the differences, as a point also divides a line in two. Nous has a fractured unity, according to Schumacher, which is both indivisible and duplicative, or double. This mode of being fractured implies that intuition is involved in language, and it is ingredient in the gathering of logos. However, it is not reducible to language. He said that logos makes vocal what nous unifies. Thus, whereas language is closely related to intuition and focalization, and depends on it, the unity remains intact. Its integrity is preserved in intuition, and the differences emerge by logos in analysis and discursive thought. Intuition is a precondition for discourse in that the focalizing unity is the basis on which the differences can unfold. Just as we have a sense of health that makes all particular senses relevant, so in syllogistic thought, we have a focal sense of relevance from which the principle can be qualified by its relation with a middle term. The thought that this activity, walking, is healthy, or that this animal is healthy, distinguishes the indivisible principle, which makes sense of the middle term, i.e., a vital principle. The analogy between different natural compounds as peculiar instantiations of being at work is also at work in thought based on the original analogy of the focalization of thought itself in the being at work of the soul, thinking, and by preserving its first actuality, knowledge. Nous, in a way, goes beyond logos, and it is in this aspect that is simply indivisible but includes infinite multiplicity, delimited by a finite plurality of explanations. This appears to be what is at the heart of the very cryptic but blisteringly insightful pages of De Anima 3:6. The universal, kathalou, as the focal meaning of an arche, is the object of intuition, and is not to be confused with a synthesis of the mind that associates different sense data. The universal, if it is an arche, must really be a unity as an expressive power or generative idea, that is to say, its nature or soul. The existence of such principles is never general. They are always in the world as concrete individuals. The nature of a thing, its inner principle, must come to rest in the soul, and not by being translated into the terms of our own concepts or symbols. The principles are not what are familiar to us, but what are relevant to the unity of that nature itself, and reside within it, as it changes through an infinity of different appearances. Now, a major confusion arises from the fact that we come to know this principle in both a general and a particular way. Aristotle said in Physics 1:1 that at first we know what a circle is, and then later distinguish its parts, and also that a child at first calls all adults mommy and daddy, and only later knows them as individuals. Schumacher's interpretation reveals a dynamic way in which analogy operates at different levels of generality. By an intensification of the process of focalization, greater degrees of distinguishing are made possible as we go towards the individual thisness of substances. We do not enrich our sense of health by making a simple proposition that delimits its meaning, the concentration and preservation of life in the self-regulated balance of vital heat, but rather by the observation of a great variety of details that are relevant to its expression in many particular phenomena. We will not go deeper into these issues here. They will need to be addressed in due time and in the appropriate context in the course of this work. We have only so far wished to indicate the way in which Aristotle's sense of intuition and focal meaning have an affinity towards Bergson's metaphysics. We have reached the final step of our detour, which reconnects the problem that is closely related to Aristotle's characterization of the ambiguity of being as a focal sense and analogy, that is, his claim that being is not a genus. This denial of the generalization or homogenization of focal meaning and analogy was of particular importance to Bergson and Ravissant. This rejection of generality is clear again in the example of health. Health is not a general notion of which healthy animal, healthy food, etc. are all specific instantiations. Healthy food is not a species of health, one subsumed by the many, but is an aspect that is expressible through the same activity, many subsumed under the one. Similarly, being is like health in that the categorical modes of being are just one aspect, but act and potency are other aspects, and we must include both in the focal sense of its being as this, an individual. Health is enacted in the convergence of healthy food, healthy actions, and doing things for the sake of health. The healthy individual itself weaves these together not as an abstract juxtaposition, but as an integral act unifying the multiplicity of processes. Health is concrete, a tension holding the diverse parts together in the activity integrating all causes. It is also generative in that it produces and sustains itself by unfolding in multiplicity. We find in this portrayal of analogy and focalization a sense of unity among qualitative multiplicity that hinges on the problem of abstract generality and concrete existence. As light is given as an analogy for intuition, we find these four key aspects for Aristotle to be indivisibly united: light, intuition, activity, focalization, and analogy. Ravissant's use of the analogy of light. It is in the second volume of Ravissant's essay on the metaphysics of Aristotle, in which we find an elaboration on this image of light to distinguish metaphysics from logical abstraction. Ravissant wrote, "Thus is born the infinite variety of colors from the alliance of light, simple and one, with all the degrees of darkness. On the one hand, the act, absolute being; on the other, power, being, a relative non-being, which exists only in the initial act of motion, and in the movement is the infinite multitude and diversity of intermediaries. It is no longer, as in the Platonic dialectic, a general idea that is common to all beings, but one that has reality only in them. It is the substantial thought, in the total reality of the most perfect action, independent of all and self-sufficient, but on which all depends, to which all relates. To be even more precise, thought absolutely active and thinking in itself is in things differently and unequally according to all the differences of the possible. The intellect described here is not a mechanism of abstraction that merely generalizes from particular individual differences to quantities and forms in nature. Instead, it is a concrete universality of expression that contains an infinity of nuances in itself and relates to each individual in its own way. Thought, like light itself, contains all colors, and united, they integrate into a pure light in which they cooperate in illumination. This is also expressive of the diversity of being in nature, which implies an unlimited diversity of motions, which he called the intermediaries or middle terms, that are manifest in the vast complexity of changes in the natural world." In Eubank's excellent article titled Ravissant's Interpretation of Aristotle, 1984, a higher form of analogy is clearly delineated. It is not verbal, logikos, but deals with substances directly as individuals discovered in experience by a super-logical intuition. Eubank concludes rightly that Ravissant was, on this point, much closer to Aristotle's thought than to anything else. The kernel of the insight is into a distinction between two opposite directions of thought, namely towards abstraction on the one hand and the concrete individual on the other. The two corresponding forms of knowledge are empty logical relations that apply to being by a, quote, discrete analogy in which the terms of relation are identical, and on the other hand, a continuous analogy that progresses, and as it does, new knowledge is produced in an irreversible direction of development. Eubank refers to a crucial illuminating footnote in which Ravissant delineated both directions using two strings of terms or formulas. Quote, we had to put into an equation the formulas on the one hand, exoterikos, allotrion, me pros ton logon, ho topo, koinon, kathalu, malon, logikon, dialectikon, endoxon, kanon. And on the other, di autu tu pragmatos, kribens, physikon, analyptikon, kata philosophia, alethes. These relations serve great use in the intelligence of Aristotle. Translation: exotic, foreign, common, general, logical, logikon in the sense of verbal, and void. And on the other, what is proper, drawn from existing givens, produced by the thing itself, exact, natural, physikon in the sense of confirms to the nature of the thing, analytical, philosophical, true. The second list of formulas are thus the domain of concrete forms, a mixing of matter and form, activities, potentialities, being an agent and a patient of motion, imperfect forms that are always in the process of completing themselves. The relationship between a species and genus is direct, e.g., human and animal, but is also artificial and external. It is just as quantity is directly linked to being. These abstract or logical relations are not on the side of truth, although they do contribute to the truth as matter does to form. Unlike the mathematical abstraction of discrete proportion, there is an analogy that uses continuous proportions, the parts of which form a suite or an irreversible series, in which the latter terms contain the former, which Ravison called subordination. This chain of continuous links is not a collection of species under a genus, not a direct link of logic or predication, but a real passage of movement, gaining power over time. The continuous proportion is the progression of a growth involving unequal parts. Sensation is to memory what memory is to experience, and again as experience is to knowledge. This continuity of analogies describes the developmental series of habituation and learning. And taking this as a paradigmatic vision, the continuous proportion, the good sense of analogy, is evidently at work in experience, in concrete intuition. This explains the developmental progression that gradually integrates many different activities, habits, pleasures, and skills, while putting them to use in higher forms of intentionality. Concrete individuals are the reality to which metaphysics must turn, emerging in an inverse direction to science. They must be obtained in experience, and experience consists in a plenitude of movements. It is from concrete movement that intuition begins, and rather than flee into abstraction or fixed concepts that are alien to movement, we must remount the chain of movements itself from effect to cause until we can distinguish among the three kinds of beings that participate in motion: a mover, a moved, and a moved mover. It is the last of these three that will include life, and it is in human life that we find the fullest expression of individuals that populate the intermediary position of this continued proportion. Whereas Aristotle forced us up to the summit of pure activity at which we found the unmoved mover, the intermediary compounds are of particular interest. We cannot simply reside at the summit, and the descent will produce only abstract knowledge. Only the remounting or rising itself will preserve the concrete singularity of the growing power in the series or suite of its real progress unfolding gradually. The descent is an inversion of reality. It smuggles along and conceals a falsehood that distorts our knowledge of reality. Being becomes nothing more than a coordination of species under a genus, a catalog of abstract forms without reality. The subordinate series of powers raises from multiplicity into unity, a convergence and growth of multiplicity integrating by a focalization. Conclusion. Eubank did not elaborate on the relationship of Ravisson's interpretation with Bergsonism, but made only an oblique reference, saying that Ravisson's two directions of knowledge, quote, go further than the Bergson of creative evolution. The latter will characterize intelligence by a natural incomprehensibility of life. End quote. Eubank clearly pointed at Bergson's debt to Ravisson's dynamic interpretation of experience. Bergson also made intuition a sort of continuous proportion that gradually builds on experience and remounts to a generative or directing cause. However, rather than reaching a summit that unites all by converging on a single source of light as thought-thinking thought, we instead reach at the highest point, the base of a cone that includes an infinity of nuances and details, the past itself as a whole in its integrality. The difference is not small, but the similarities are enormous. All we can say for now, anticipating what will be made clear in the due course of this study, is that Bergson made the vertical genesis of this rising of developmental progress into a horizontal genesis that brings into existence higher forms by means of transformations that involve, indispensably, an advance into novelty and contingency. Foti, 1998. Nevertheless, the horizontal development of evolution is, for Bergson, a growing series in which prior achievements are put to use or subordinated to later forms of development. This horizontal development is, in fact, what explains the very way in which Bergson himself retrieved the dynamic sense of being from Ravissant and Aristotle, Plotinus, Leibniz, etc. After retrieving, Bergson surpassed them in a creative evolution of the dynamic sense of being itself. While there is no evolution in Aristotle, we will see later that Aristotle's God seems to guarantee the continuity of time as an irreversible advance into novelty, and an ecstatic horizon of the future which is open, that is, contingently including the unforeseeable emergence of unique individuals. We should therefore remain hesitant to take sides with Bergson's narrow critique of Aristotle, either that he remained trapped up in a task of rolling up all the immanent forms into an abstraction that is alien to movement, or that his use of intuition is thereby strictly abstract or intellectual. In Bergson's evasion and erasure of his Aristotelian inspirations, he pretended to grasp Aristotle's philosophy as a static totality without interiority. He was content to take it externally and to make of it a prototypical expression of the absent-mindedness of natural habits of thought developed in practical life, a cinematographical mechanism operating exclusively in terms of presence to consciousness. Bergson claimed that before his work on time and free will, he had no proper method for his philosophy. This method he developed was a critique of the faculties of thought as primarily practical, that the intellect is only suited to purely practical application. With this method, intuition reverses the natural bend of our intellectual habits and dispenses with artificial symbols. This is his method for evading the problems he attributes to Aristotelianism as thought inextricably tied to symbols.